Thank you, Mrs Millen. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship today. And I'm grateful that this debate has been granted today, as it is of great importance to my constituency, and I imagine that of every member here today. Shortly after I was elected to represent the City of Durham in 2019, one of the first items that came across my desk was a letter from Andy Byers, head teacher at Framwellgate School, inviting me to come and visit the school to see for myself the condition the school was in, and I have to say I was appalled. Framwellgate School was built in the 1960s, and sadly that shows. The school is too small and cannot grow to meet the needs of an expanding pupil population and changing curriculum. It's spread across multiple blocks and there's no social space for pupils. There's an increasing number of pupils who need more specialist provision and more space, while the upper floors have no disabled access and aren't compliant with the Disability Discrimination Act. And this is before I even mention that the site is extremely prone to flooding. However, as frustrating as it was to see the learning environment for pupils in my constituency, that it was even more frustrating that Framwellgate School had in fact already been approved for a rebuild. The problem is that this was in 2009 under the last Labour government, who recognised the poor condition of the school and its potential impact on the education of young people in Durham. Sadly, when the coalition government came to power the following year, plans for a rebuild were promptly scrapped by the then Education Secretary, the Right Honourable Member for Surrey Heath. Now, 12 years after it was first allocated for a rebuild, the school has been overlooked for 2 rounds of funding under the current scheme, despite many of the issues that first made it eligible for a rebuild getting worse. Framwellgate School's case is a truly desperate one. And the reason I applied for this debate is that the problems are not limited to a single school. I've had almost identical discussions to those with Mr Byers, with the head teachers across the constituency. I've spoken extensively with Mr Hamill at St Leonard's, who are in a similarly overdue rebuild position. The roof is in a shocking condition. Like Fram, it has extremely limited disabled access, while the very fabric of the building is completely inefficient. On top of this, one primary school head wrote to me with a shocking analysis of her school. She writes, "Our school is in a dreadful state. The classrooms are poorly ventilated and are freezing in winter and boiling in summer. Our junior yard is not stable. Tree root damage is prolific. Our drains block regularly. We have ever-increasing cracks in the walls and the floors, leaks under the floor and from the roof in some places, rising damp, a lift and hall floor." I could go on. And I cannot imagine how frustrating it must be for the educators, pupils, parents who share the same goal of wanting every child to have the best possible start in life, only for their efforts to be limited by the poor condition of many of our schools. And whenever I've visited a school in Durham, I've been struck by the dedication and the passion of the staff, as well as the inquisitive and talented pupils. And I've witnessed firsthand the role our schools play in the community and the effort they put into the well-being of children in Durham. Yet when the Minister hears stories of flooded classrooms, overcrowded schools, rising damp and poor ventilation, can they honestly say that the pupils at these schools are learning in the best environment possible? And while ministers are always happy to talk about levelling up in the vaguest possible terms, to me they cannot claim to have come close to levelling up the North East until the children in our region have the same life chances as those in the wealthiest regions. This can only be done by transforming the infrastructure and resources across our region, and much of this has to start in our schools. But for me, the state of the school in Framwellgate and St Leonard's in Durham, it's really the perfect yardstick for the government's pledge to level up the North East. And given that it was first selected for a rebuild under the last Labour government over a decade ago, can the Minister honestly say that education has improved in the City of Durham if they cannot even commit to rebuilding a school that the last Labour government pledged to rebuild in 2009? We've had 12 years of Conservative governments, and the condition of many of our schools continue to deteriorate even further. They're not asking for a lot, only what they were promised. And in comparison, let's consider the case of Belmont Church of England Primary School and Belmont Community School, which were allocated funding for a new state-of-the-art joint campus under the then Labour-run Durham County Council. And it just goes to show the difference that Labour makes when we are in power. So before I move on, I want to extend an invitation to the Minister or to the Minister for School Standards when he watches this debate later on. Please come to Durham and let me show them the condition of some of the schools in Durham, like Framwellgate School, so that they can see for themselves the conditions that many of our children have to learn in and many of our staff have to work in. Although if it rains the night before, they might want to bring their wellies. Now, before I finish, I want to speak about the rollout of the school rebuilding programme more broadly, as I've got a number of concerns, many of which have been raised with me by the head teachers in Durham. First is the lack of transparency in the first stages of the programme in terms of how and in what order funding would be awarded and the difficulties this has caused schools. After consulting with head teachers in Durham last year, I called for a list ranking the conditions of all applicant schools to be published, so that schools could see where they were in the queue for a rebuild and their need compared to other schools. This would combat the growing concern amongst head teachers that schools in electorally advantageous constituencies are being targeted for building projects, concerns that are driven by the lack of transparency in the process, with unclear criteria and unpublished CDC reports. And this isn't helped by the superficial nature of CDC surveys, which simply aren't fit for purpose. I know that for a fact Framwellgate School felt it necessary to invest in their own intrusive surveys to demonstrate the issues with electrics, drainage and so on in order to show their extreme need. In addition to this, many heads are frustrated at having to apply for condition improvement funding to carry out repairs and maintenance, as they're held to account by the Department for Education for not maintaining the building or the site, while also trying to avoid limiting funding opportunities for a new build. I've been told explicitly by one head teacher that the two schemes conflict and the process isn't joined up. They pointed out that they could apply for and receive funding to repair the roofs of their school, only to find a year later that they were successful with a school rebuilding programme bid. This has meant potentially a massive waste of public money, especially if the amount of CIF investment will turn a school that is in need of a rebuild into one that is fit for purpose. They continue to age and decline, and they reduce the maintenance, the impact of the maintenance funding. Countless schools have exceeded the life of the buildings, resulting in the government throwing good money after lost causes when that could be going towards a new build. A final issue that's been raised with me in my discussions with head teachers is that even when they are successful with the bid, that they will receive an off-the-shelf school with little scope for joined-up approach that meets the specific needs of the school or the community. With that in mind, I'd like to ask the Minister the following questions about the design of schools under the programme. Firstly, how much scope is there for schools and communities to input into the design of the school, and can this incorporate other funding from local authorities, like the sale of land, for example? Secondly, what have they learned from the pandemic about ensuring adequate ventilation and air cleaning in buildings, and will this be incorporated into the design of new builds? Similarly, what have they learned from the pandemic about supporting teachers with the technology they need, and how will that be incorporated into new buildings? And finally, how does the government's school rebuilding work tie in with their work on achieving net zero and their manifesto commitment around retrofitting the public buildings? So to finish, I am aware that the government will no doubt point to the size of the rebuild programme, and they'll argue that it's simply not possible to immediately fund a rebuild for every school in need. However, there must be a recognition that the decision to scrap the Building Schools for the Future scheme has meant that schools already in need of a rebuild are still in desperate need, while schools that previously could have waited are now in similar states of disrepair, creating an even greater need across the country. It will therefore be of little consolation to my constituents in Durham to hear that a school on the other side of England will be receiving a rebuild, while their local school fails and falls further into disrepair, damaging the life chances of the children who attend. I truly hope that the Government will listen to the concerns of members present today to ensure that every child in Durham, and indeed across the country, has access to a school building that is fit to learn in. Thank you.